Okay, let's talk about quadra values.
Yeah.
For alpha, one thing that I know about this type is that they like to keep an upbeat emotional atmosphere, and it's usually positive emotions. Like SI, I guess, would be they want to be pleasant.
I would put it a little differently, but yes,
Okay.
I see that alpha as the theme of positive emotionality.
But that doesn't mean that they can't express negative emotions when they're feeling very negative. So do you think that this is something that transfers across the whole quadra? Like, is this an alpha trait?
It's certainly common to a lot of alpha types. Probably most characteristically is the SEI that has difficulty with presenting themselves as negative. They view themselves as being a burden to others if they appear to be too negative. And this is often a conscious issue for them, right? Is they may not necessarily be optimistic internally, and being able to act joyfully as a reflection perhaps of their own internal difficulties with being optimistic. Not everybody, but it's a common theme, I think, in some alpha types, and particularly in SEIs sometimes. And I think that it's shared by all alphas to some extent, but it's much easier for certain of the alpha types to drift from this, particularly ILEs, who can sometimes be relatively insensitive to the way that other people around them respond to the joyfulness or lack thereof of their messages.
Would you say that it's a quadra value for alpha to try to remain joyful?
Yes, but it's the same issue. Is I don't think that all of the alphas express this quite equally. Right, for instance, creating an atmosphere of positive emotionality and appreciating atmosphere of positive emotionality are somewhat different things. The creating an atmosphere of positive emotionality is, for instance, ESEs are often focused on doing actively, and sometimes ILEs also, but very little, for instance, in the LII. It's something that's quite difficult.
But they appreciate it.
Sometimes, often. But again, it relates to whether or not it taps into something that they're aware of. In some cases, they're not aware of it, and they may be inclined to dismiss the idea of the atmosphere around them being positive.
Okay. Would you say ILEs are also like that, or SEIs?
To some extent, I think that it's much easier for ILEs to be aware of the atmosphere around them being positive. And I think that SEIs, like some of the any ego types, have perhaps an element of uncertainty to them in terms of not figuring out exactly the way in which they want to influence the situation and exactly how they act in it on a conscious level. But in spite of that uncertainty, they're often contributors to atmospheres of positive emotionality.
I think I would agree with that. Okay, so some types are able to contribute to the positive emotionality of the group better than others in the alpha quadra.
Well, it's an individual dynamics, right? And particularly individual dynamics with respect to the super-id functions, as we've been discussing, right? This is not all of this diatribe about what does it mean for the mobilizing function to be strong. These are not unrelated to these topics. If you ask what is the expression of quadra values, the way I see it, again, the quadra is as a type. All of the alpha types express positive emotionality. They merely do so in slightly different flavors, but they're all express positive emotionality. And they'll certainly have the potential to be expressing positive emotionality in the same way.
All right, so positive emotionality is a quadra value of alpha. Alphas also like to talk about theoretical topics. The way I see it is almost they're indirect. They don't really like to talk about concrete things. So the NE, what kind of flavor does that add to the alpha quadra, the NE and there's an NETI?
This is of the 8 quadra themes, I have the least compelling name for this, which is essentially abstract structure. But I understand what you're talking about, right? And I'm open to finding a better name because I don't like that name, but I've called it that in some of my writing. Not too much of it, really, because I don't talk about this quadra is one of the most difficult for me to understand, and I think that's reflected in my writing.
Do you acknowledge that alpha and gamma would be conflicting quadras?
They're opposing quadras.
Okay, what does that mean?
I would say this. It means that the messages of the alpha quadra are more directly mutually exclusive with the messages of the gamma quadra than they are with the adjacent quadras.
Okay, and the adjacent quadras are beta and delta.
Yeah.
And they share values with beta and delta. Okay, which values do they share with beta? It's the Fe and Ti. Okay, so do you see these quadras as similar, the beta and alpha?
They're more similar, I would say, than alpha and gamma.
Let's talk about beta. I've heard you say that beta is the most dynamic quadra. What does that mean?
The way I see what it means is that beta has the greatest range of expressions. That is, by nature, the expressions of what it means to be a beta are quite variable, depending on the place of life.
You said the place of life?
Yeah.
As in their experiences that they've acquired?
Yes, but also that people are in different stages of life and have different views and things which evolve over the course of one's life. And in the beta quadra, for instance, the relevance of what place you are in life is greater than in that of other quadras. One of the themes in beta is ideological conflict. This means that betas have a tendency, not always, but as part of their values, have a tendency to subscribe to one particular set of rules describing the world. As they subscribe to one particular set of rules, sometimes the ideology to which they subscribe rapidly changes and appears suddenly. They went from seeing the world one way to suddenly seeing it a different way and occupying a very different place in their lives and possibly in society, which can appear to be a very abrupt transition to the outside, which may or may not be an abrupt transition internally, but it's merely a shift in the set of rules and not in the overall values structure.
Do they, basically what you're saying is they take their ideologies very seriously and those ideologies can
No,
differ.
I wouldn't say that betas always take some betas for sure take their ideologies very seriously. So do some alphas. I would say that the idea of structure, in pedagogical clarity, what are the rules by which the world works?
Okay, and this is
an important conscious dilemma for these types. Okay. Regardless of the degree to which their answer to this question of what are the rules in which the world operates by, regardless of whether or not they satisfactorily answer that question in their conscious awareness or their internal dialogue. I realize this is sort of a densely packed abstraction, but
no.
I think it's pretty easy to apply that abstraction to lived examples.
The IEI and the LSI, the SLE and the EIE are the types that we're talking about. You said that it's a conscious question that they have whether they're aware of it or not.
Yes, but I mean something somewhat deliberate by saying that. In the same way that a weakness is a conscious dilemma when it becomes played into conscious awareness, the meaning of being a conscious dilemma is that it's a pressure point for these types, if you will, on these types. It isn't necessarily always a focus of conscious attention, but perhaps has the potential to become a focus of conscious attention.
Okay, what about this idea of social hierarchies? Do you think that is a thing that exists with these types?
Basically, no. I understand why this is referred to as a theme, but I mean, it's not part of my writing. I don't talk about the social hierarchies that betas get into. And I think it's a possible way of seeing the some types in this quadra sometimes, but for instance, has almost nothing to do with IEIs, who are likely to precisely to shun the idea of being a social. This is a concept in ideology. This is a concept stemming from TI and SE, which is that basically saying these are the rules of, say, our organization. Yeah, these are the rules by which you should abide. And if you don't abide by these rules, then there will be consequences. As in, like, there are many organizations for which this is very pertinent. I don't know. The mafia has a code of conduct. If you're a member of the mafia and you don't abide by the code of conduct, then they'll kill you or something like this. And this is important in the sense, I'm not trying to make comparisons between the mafia and military organizations, but for instance, military organizations are the same way. Is right. I mean, they're not going to kill you if you don't abide by the rules, but you will get court-martialed if you don't abide by all the rules. or maybe you won't get court-martialed, but you'll have to like clean the toilets or whatever. And this is just these are parts of the way that these organizations operate.
Okay.
And certain organizations operate. And of course, the structure of these organizations has to do with rules and applying these rules and a forceful implementation of the rules rather than an abstract implementation of the rules.
What would be an example of an abstract implementation of the rules? Like, let's say you're at work and you get a white slip for coming in late.
I don't think there's what is abstract about that.
Yeah, well, I didn't think that was abstract. It's just not very similar to your idea.
What's an example of an abstract implementation of the rule? I mean, the example that I always use for this, and it's not the ideal example, but it's a good enough example, is Robespierre, who is the namesake for the LII type, who was deeply interested in law, essentially, and in the impersonal carrying out of justice. But as a person, he did this in a somewhat abstract way, really not thinking about the consequences of the ways in which his way of meting out justice really affected people. So an example, for instance, is the ideas that are enshrined in law. For figures like Robespierre or Thomas Jefferson, who developed all of these principles in his head about how people should act and how the government should interact with these people, rather than really applying them in some concrete way. Although eventually many of the principles did become concrete, but certainly not all of them.
When these ideas were created, they weren't really looking at the way things
Well,
happen.
I think in some cases they were. I think, for instance, in the case of Maximilien Robespierre, there was a lot more that Robespierre was not considering about the details of implementing his ideas about law and how people should operate in the sort of the early days of the French Revolution that clearly blindsided him. But there's the other side of this is you have people who envision things about the law in ways that have not become reality at all. Ron Paul is an example here, where he would love to live in some kind of libertarian utopia, which doesn't exist, and maybe it can exist or maybe it can't exist. It's hard to tell because it resembles nothing like the concrete way of government operating that we see in society now. So yeah, I have difficulty discussing the abstract structure concepts. I need some better examples, as you can tell.
Okay. Now, we were talking about beta, so maybe instead of talking about abstract concepts, we can just talk about what is not abstract, and that is that if they were going to...
Well, so what we talked about is social hierarchies, right? So this is a hierarchy in the sense that it is a beta theme to have organizations that operate in this way, where there's a very clear set of rules that has to do with a hierarchy. But I tend to think that this is almost nothing to do with the way that betas think about the world that they live in consciously, the majority of beta individuals. And part of it is because it strongly conflicts with their sense. So one theme of beta that is important, which is somewhat difficult to grasp the reasons why, I think, is authenticity, which is particularly important in the IEI that also has demonstrative FI. So betas value, in addition to valuing ideological conflict, they have a value of passionate energizability, which is essentially they value the intensity of the expression of their internal state. And for people that value the expression of their internal state, they view, as other FE valuing types do, the self as somewhat volatile and dynamic and easily changeable. Partly because FE types themselves are easily changeable. They have many emotions that are rapidly changeable, and they seem to lack a sense of self. And as a consequence, they also view other people as just as malleable, often incorrectly, but sometimes correctly.
Do you think this is something that the SLE and the LSI share?
Yes.
The lack of sense of self, is that something that you think is across the board?
Yeah, so it's a tricky thing to talk about. I would say that the lack of sense of self, I'll say it a slightly different way. A lack of stable sense of self is a key issue mostly for the EIE. Also somewhat accessible to the IEI and to the SLE, but most poignant for the EIE. Sense of self is just a difficult word because what is meant by the self is very specific to the context that you're speaking of, because it means a lot of things. People's self-concepts become very complicated.
This could be maybe something that they consciously think about because they view themselves as changeable. And is the lack of sense of stable self related to their desire to express themselves fully in the moment?
Yes, but somewhat indirectly. I mean, I think that both of those are sort of sides of who they are. I think that the understanding the basic concepts are important to understanding the more complex thing that I was talking about, which eventually will relate to this question of social hierarchy.
Okay, so you don't think that those are the basic expressions of this quadra?
The base, well, I mean, these are, you get into difficult messages, but the most basic messages of the quadra, I say, are ideological conflict and passionate energizability. And then you get into some other, somewhat more intricate territory. I have ways of talking about that territory that are...
No, I just thought that those were important points. The ideological conflict and the passionate energizability.
And all the other themes I think are important, but I think it's difficult to understand what is the key concept. I don't know that that's a useful distinction even, right? Because they're all important concepts, except that the different types express them a little differently. I think the IEI is the most... The EIA is the broadest emotional range, but the IEI is the most difficult in some sense, because whereas the EIE really has the lack of stable sense of self, and sometimes these individuals are often able to see that of themselves, right? The lack of stability in themselves, sometimes I can think of people from the board that this is sort of true of, and many of them I think would recognize it, and some of them might not. The lack of stability is often somewhat on the surface. There's so little grounding that it becomes obvious to them often. But in the IEIs, it's more subtle because there's more grounding, partly because of demonstrative FI. The way I see it is that they're more grounded in the way that they appear, and also that in some sense also they recognize, not necessarily consciously, that in fact there's not much stability in the way that they act. And therefore, the authentic expression of what they are becomes very important to them, because they view a lot of people as interacting. They view the other people around them as interacting, not necessarily with stability. And they view most of their interactions with the world around them as essentially superficial, as dynamically changing, and reserve this idea of having a stable interaction for only the situations that they feel that it matters. And so the question of authenticity, especially their own authenticity towards the outside situations in the world, and actually showing themselves that they can be stable, becomes a conscious question. And this is why, for instance, if you imagine the beta type, just for a moment imagine that all of the beta types express it in the same way, which they do to some extent, but the II is the most pressing issue of authenticity. Somebody who is concerned about authenticity and concerned about the way that they convey the messages of themselves as a person, what sort of person am I, and is the way that I am comporting myself consistent with the sense of person that I am. A person with that message on their mind is not also paying very much attention to the hierarchy of the way that other people around them are interacting. In fact, they're often oriented towards the hierarchy of other people around them as something irrelevant, something that has nothing to do with the authenticity of their interaction. And really, I think this is something that all of the beta types share. Probably SLE's least so, but I think that dynamic makes it so that this question of being in a social hierarchy is not a very conscious issue for these types.
Do you think that, say, when they come together as a group, they sort of do form a social hierarchy, but not necessarily on purpose or consciously?
No.
No? Okay.
I mean, I would be willing to entertain counterexamples, but I don't know that I'm convinced by... Again, I don't think that these are a very conscious focus, so I don't think that this is true.
People who have SE in their ego, in many situations, tend to act as a leader or attempt to assert themselves.
What does that have to do with a hierarchy? But for instance, the SEs would be the same way as this. And in fact, they are, right? SEs can have positions in some kind of a social hierarchy just as easily.
Yes.
And this is probably SE and SLE. The SLE probably has the least focus on this question of authenticity, but I think it's very accessible to them as well. So I don't...
By very accessible, do you mean it's something that they can think about?
Yeah, exactly. And it becomes a pressure point, a very conscious issue that isn't always a focus of awareness.
So what do you mean by pressure point?
That's what I mean by it. It's a very conscious issue that isn't always the focus of awareness.
All right. So the idea of social hierarchy, basically, you don't see it that way, and a lot of people do see it this way, and then a lot of people also say that they don't really
I guess I might be living in my own world a little bit, having these ideas of quadras that I've had for many years. But who sees it this way? Like, is this really a thing that Jack talks about as an important facet of Beta Quadra? Because it's not something that. I mean, I understand Beta Quadra is a difficult quadra, and a lot of the themes I think are really important, like this thing about authenticity, are not addressed in other people's writing. For instance, Augusta doesn't address authenticity as a part of her writing, not very clearly anyway. She does kind of. I mean, if you think about IEIs and what is the character of an IEI, but I think that my answer to the question of what is the character of an IEI is much more complex than Augusta's answer, and also much more complex than Jack's answer. I don't think that Augusta treats the beta as fundamentally having social hierarchy. She does in some sense describe it this way, but yeah, I don't think it's a very important theme.
In some ways, I think that the types that have SE in their ego, do assert themselves over other people.
What does that have to do with social hierarchy?
I don't know. I mean, I don't even know.
It seems to me like it has to do with, right, as you said, an SE dominant types, let's say, often want to try to play the role of the leader in a group. Okay, fine, but that doesn't have to do with a social hierarchy. They're not necessarily trying to implement a social hierarchy, including in the SLE's case. Okay. Rather, they're trying to sort of get what they want, right? There's an aspect of conscious volition and how do I interact with the situation in order to get what I want, which I think is more closely aligned with what you're talking about than this idea that it's important to implement a social hierarchy.
Other ways that people talk about this is saying something like the SLE kind of like gathers together people that can help them.
Like I think it takes some issue to that, right? The SLE is the person that collects people that can help them. It's very difficult to respond to that because it's quite general. I think it's the SEE that collects people that can help them, right? And the SEE is not really very attentive to people. They collect people maybe in a very hands-off way, and I don't know that. Okay, they could be. I can understand in what way that the SLE views people as objects with particular uses in an emotionally sterile way. Going out of one's way to collect those objects is a little bit more.
Oh, that's not really what I meant either.
I don't know. It's difficult to say, but I'm not sure that I quite agree with it.
It's actually something that I heard Galenko say, but I might be.
Okay, well, I'm not interested in what Galenko says.
I know you're not. Anyway, okay. Let's talk about what SE is.
What does it mean to value SE?
Yes.
It means to have greater attentiveness to external demands than internal demands.
Internal demands would be something like eating or emotion.
This room is too hot.
Okay.
I don't like the room because it's too hot, which is something that SE types are sometimes sensitive to, but usually they're not really that sensitive to it, right? They're more sensitive towards whatever it is they actually want out of the world at large, which can sometimes be quite erratic, right? As particularly in SE dominant types, they're not always aware of what they want from the world at large, but they will sometimes decide that they want some particular thing and then set out to attain it. And they pay little attention to whether or not the room is hot while they're on the process of attaining it.
Saying that they're paying attention to the room is hot sounds like an external demand, but it's an internal demand because they're actually thinking about how it feels to them, right?
Unless the room being hot is itself the focus of whatever their goal is, then it is not an external demand, right?
Well, what is an external demand? Is it covering?
It is the focus of whatever the goal is, right? So there's some, right? As I said, imagine an SE dominant type. The goal is the SE dominant type is an impulsive person that sometimes decides on a whim to become the emperor of China. And then they decide to go and do all of the things that would be needed in order to do this. And maybe they will quickly see that it's not actually very feasible because they didn't think very far ahead, that there's a process in place for how to become the emperor of China. And it's not very easy for them to do it because they're actually a citizen of the United States and they're not going to go and do it very easily. But in any case, right, that was their goal. They didn't think it through at all, and they erratically set some goal for themselves and then sought to meet the conditions of achieving that goal and accomplishing it. And whether or not they actually did accomplish it is another matter. The point is that assume that this impulsive person who is deeply invested, at least for the moment, in becoming the emperor of China, might have to sit in a room with some bureaucrats that happens to be a little bit hot and do this anyway, rather than give up their goal to be the emperor of China, would just sit in the room for a few minutes while they get called to the DMV to get a license plate number they want.
Oh god. Is it true that SE is about attaining new ground or controlling things or wanting more or wanting something and getting that?
Wanting something and getting it, I would say, sure. And I would say the attaining ground sometimes, but it isn't necessarily related to the goals that are concretely held.
All right, so it's about the external world and how they interact with it.
Yes,
Okay.
exactly.
And the internal world would that be more NE and TI and SI?
Well, I don't understand what TI, but so by internal demands, external demands, exactly what you said, is the way in which one interacts with the external world to get whatever they're looking to get out of it. A nature of an internal demand is the immediate lived experience of themselves in the world, of the individual in their environment. So what is the quality of their environment, and what is the lived experience of the individual being in that environment, whatever its quality? So for instance, one quality could be the environment is too hot. It's 100 degrees and it's uncomfortable.
All right, so are you saying that SE and SI are basically focused on the same things? You've said this before, but they're different directions of the same thing. I think one time I've heard this. Is this a true statement? That SE would be more about impacting the world or doing what you wanted in the physical world, and then SI would be more about accepting the world as it is and trying to enjoy that?
I would put it a little differently. To outline, for instance, the ways in which they're similar, right? So SE and SI are both about the experience of the world, the way the individual appraises their experience about the world. And the SE focuses on the experience about the world with respect to what they interact with. An introverted sensation doesn't focus on the experience of the world with respect to what they interact with. Rather, it focuses on the immediate lived experience of the world. So the way that I would say being attentive to the quality of the world around you, the immediate quality of the world around you, has something to do with accepting, I think. I think fundamentally it has something to do with accepting the world around you. But a better way of saying that is that the individual is attentive not to the way that they can impact the world around them, but to the way in which they can best fit themselves into the experience of the ongoing world around them. Finding the appropriate position by which to maximize the goodness of fit between their individual and their surroundings. You can see in what way this has to do with any as well.
No, I can't. Let me just see if I understood you correctly, if I can contrast SI and SE really quick. SI would be about seeing how you best fit into your environment, and then SE is more about how to make the environment fit to you. So that's how they would be opposites almost.
A little simplified, but yes.
Okay.
It's very similar to the way I see it.
How does what you said about SI go with any?
In the aspect that it seeks to optimize something, maybe I don't fully disambiguate these two elements in this case, but there's a part where there's an attentiveness to the world, and there's a part where there's which you could view the attentiveness to the world itself, the lived experience of the world as SI, and then the part where you optimize that experience within the constraints of the problem as the any part of the problem. Which is what any does, right? It optimizes the situation without, for instance, forcefully going in and demanding that the problem be different, but rather finding a clever way, so to speak, of altering the conditions to do something better without expending unneeded effort. But the reason why I don't disambiguate these, maybe as cleanly as somebody else might, is because in the context of the solution, which has to do with optimizing the individual towards the condition of their environment, is often something that's practiced by the SI egotype and not by the NE egotype that isn't aware of the physical environment in the first place. As an example...
Wait, what type is not aware of the physical environment?
The NE egotype, right, which has the SI suggestive. As a concrete example, suppose that you have an SI dominant type and an NE dominant type who are on a hike. This is not so loosely based on personal experience. The NE dominant type basically thinks of this hike as this is an opportunity to have a hike, see what's there. Let's go explore this forest, this abandoned forest that no one has ever been to before, and see what is there. Isn't it cool? Let's go. We'll see what happens. And in doing so, they go and walk around the forest for like 10 or 15 minutes, and then they get thirsty. But they were so excited about exploring the forest that they didn't bring any water. But if they have the SI person along, the SI person was anticipating in advance the quality of their physical state and said, oh, I might get thirsty, and then brought the water. Again, loosely based on my personal experience as somebody that doesn't remember to bring water when I go and walk in parks.
On 10-minute hikes.
Yeah, on 10-minute hikes. The SI type is attentive to whether or not they're going to need the water, right? There's a predetermined attention to the physical state. That's the realistic example, is that the SI type brings water and the NE type doesn't bring water, even if the common stereotype that the NE type forgets to eat is usually unfounded in my view. But the common stereotype adjusted to the idea that they will not remember to bring water, I think is correct. Let's be even more simple and say that really the SI type is focused on optimizing the environment around them to best interact with the environment around them, to optimize the conditions. Let's say that the environment is too hot. The thermostat reads 100 degrees and it's very hot in a house. And the SI type decides to turn the thermostat down. And the NE type doesn't notice that the thermostat is reading too high and doesn't turn it down, despite in some theoretical way suffering from the negative conditions of their environment, without fully realizing it, perhaps. Again, in some theoretical way, the part where they don't bring water is more realistic.
Yeah, because you actually need water.
Well, because it's an anticipatory demand. I think this is really true of the any dominant types in particular, is that they don't really anticipate physical constraints. But the common stereotype, right, is that they forget to eat. If it's 100 degrees in their room, they wouldn't notice because they're just not attentive to the physical environment. I don't know, other things like they forget to clean their apartment and then they don't respect the degree to which having a clean apartment affects their internal state, which might be more realistic. But the thing that isn't realistic is another stereotype of SLEs, which I don't think is very common in the English community, but is something that exists in the Russian community. The ILE walks into like telephone poles because they're not aware that they're there. The majority of these conditions are not terribly realistic scenarios for a competent person who is not dead yet to experience. But I think the scenario of failing to anticipate that you will get thirsty and want water because you were just not thinking about it is completely realistic.
I would definitely think about it, but then I would just decide that I didn't care.
Well, that is another approach.
Yeah, it would just be like an annoying thing that just didn't really matter as much, unless life and death were on the line. Okay, so NE seeks to optimize something, and SI seeks to optimize conditions of the world. So NE and SI together in a quadra.
Closely related. Well, the SI type also values NE. They have NE as a quite important element of their psyche. They bleed into each other in the way that SE expresses itself in a realistic setting, and I incorporate this into my definition. And perhaps some people wouldn't do it quite that way, but I think it's more useful.
I've seen MBTI definitions that they look at the functions that they value, and then they look at the shadow function, and then they explain how they work together. It kind of mixed in the SE and SI together in types.
I'm not really familiar with that very much. Not from. I haven't looked at like a lot. I mean, there are a lot of models that purport to be advanced, and I'm mostly not interested in them. So they're like focus on shadow functions, like BB's model and things like this. I don't know if shadow functions are even a part of BB's model, but I think they are. I think it's an 8-function model. So I don't know, but it's not something that I'm used to seeing in the MBTI literature.
No, the first time I saw it actually was either yesterday or the day before. Yeah, because I was trying to...
Somebody has thought of it. That's not shocking, but...
Okay, let's talk about the Gamma Quadra and Gamma themes. And I think I know this one pretty good. So I think that Gammas are serious types, and that means that they are focused on the present reality and achieving things.
They are not... Are you talking about the Rhinean sense of the word serious? Because it doesn't sound like you are.
No. I think that SE and TE together is serious, especially with FI.
So if you're talking about like a colloquial sense of the word serious, yeah, I would say it's okay.
But not like completely serious, just more serious than the other quadras.
It strikes me, and this is actually traced to Augusta's writing initially, right? The ILI is not outwardly serious. But this is true of some other types as well. There's something about taking things seriously that I think is important to this quadra. But
Is it more about being practical or saying what you mean and, you know?
yeah, but that's an element of all of FI valuing types, right?
Okay.
So I would say that that's true. That all FI types prefer the subdued interactive style, where they don't have to guess at understanding people's emotions. Regarding serious, it's a difficult thing to describe in the colloquial term, and I think it's true, although it's a little bit difficult to understand. Augusta describes the ILI as externally goofy, and somebody the inner world is opaque.
So the
And
ILI.
the opaquely that the what Augusta noted, sometimes it's described in this type, but often not, is that the outward expression of interacting with the world doesn't convey the seriousness a lot of the time that they may experience as part of, let's say, being an FI valuing type that prefers to have a subdued emotionality. That instead, the way that they often express the way that they see themselves is saying things that are opposite what they really mean.
Wait, the
As,
ILI
as
does
Augusta
that?
said, goofy.
Oh, okay.
I think it's true, although I think it's not always obvious in what ways
Yeah.
that's true.
I don't think that the ILI is like completely serious all the time. I would have said goofy.
It might not be Augusta's word, but it's a word from that I remember from something that's based on one of Augusta's translations.
I said
I
it
don't
the
know.
other day. I was talking to Ben and some people, and they said, "Well, look how serious the ILI is." And I'm like, "Well, they're not that serious, really. They're kind of
Yeah,
silly."
right. That's right. But I think that's a surface tendency, right?